A de Havilland Beaver burns roughly 85 liters of aviation fuel for every hour its engine runs, and that number, dull as it sounds, is the reason we know what Vernon Odell was doing. On the morning of June 9, 1984, Odell topped off both tanks at the fuel dock in Sable Lake, a settlement of about 200 people in northern British Columbia, loaded a single passenger and 400 pounds of gear onto his float plane, and taxied out onto the water. His logbook records the trip as 2.1 hours in the air, out to a remote cabin site on the edge of the Styking Plateau and back again, empty. But when the dock attendant fueled that same aircraft the following morning, he wrote down the volume it took to fill the tanks, the way he always did, on a carbon paper receipt that went into a drawer and stayed there for 7 years. The receipt says the Beaver took on fuel for barely 1 hour of flying, not 2.1. 1. The plane had gone somewhere that morning and it had come back. It simply had not gone anywhere near where Vernon Odell said it had. The passenger on that flight was a 53-year-old prospector named Gordon Halvorsen, and no one ever saw him again. His family was told he had been dropped off safely at his mineral claim and that the wilderness had taken him, the way it takes people up there, quietly and without explanation. For 7 years, that was the story. For 7 years, families across the region accepted the same story, told in the same calm voice, by the same man, because in that country the bush pilot is the person you trust with your life as a matter of routine. There is no road to most of those lakes. There is no other way in. When Odell said he had watched a passenger wave from the shoreline before he lifted off, there was no one on earth who could say otherwise. Except, as it turned out, his own paperwork, because Vernon Odell logged flights he never flew to destinations he never reached. And the numbers he wrote down do not agree with the fuel he burned. And one man, one single passenger, stepped off that airplane at the last moment and lived to describe what he saw in the cargo compartment. We will come back to him. Here's what this episode is going to lay out, piece by piece, from the documents. First, the 7 names that appear in Odell's charter manifests between 1976 and 1989 for whom no arrival, no pickup, and no confirmed sighting exists anywhere in the record afterward. Second, that single fuel receipt from June 9, 1984, and the insurance auditor who found it in a drawer in 1991 and understood, within about an hour, what she was looking at. Third, the account of Wallace Deer, a trapper who boarded Odell's Beaver in the fall of 1985 and got off again before takeoff, over an argument about a dog and what he later told the Royal Canadian Mounted Police he had noticed lashed under the rear seat. Fourth, what a volunteer dive team brought up from the bottom of Sable Lake in September of 1994, 40 minutes flying time from Kestrel Lake, and what a DNA comparison finally confirmed in 2009. And fifth, the question the file still cannot answer, the one investigators privately consider the worst part of this case. Not how many passengers Vernon Odell flew nowhere, but how many the record never captured at all. Before we begin, a note on where this account comes from. Everything in this episode is drawn from the surviving charter manifests, the coroner service summaries, civil aviation maintenance and fuel records, and the RCMP, historical case review released decades later. Vernon Odell died before any investigation began, was never arrested, and was never charged, and where the record runs out, this episode will say so plainly rather than guess. The families in this story deserved answers, and mostly they did not get them. And nothing here will pretend otherwise. Gordon Halvorsen had been prospecting the country north of Kestrel Lake for most of his adult life, the son of Norwegian immigrants who settled in the Bulkley Valley in the 1920s. He had held a free miner certificate continuously since 1951, and he worked his claims the old way, on foot, alone, with a compass and a canvas tent. He lived in Smithers in the winters, in a small house he had paid off years earlier, and every June he flew north with his gear, his sample bags, and a rock hammer with his initials stamped into the steel of the head, a tool he had carried since the 1950s. Prospecting in British Columbia in those years ran on physical proof. A claim was held by staking posts you cut and inscribed yourself, and it was kept alive by documented assessment work, which meant Halvorsen's summers produced a paper trail of their own, sample bags tagged by hand, assay results mailed back from a laboratory in Vancouver every fall. His daughter Anne kept those assay envelopes in a shoebox, 30 seasons of them, and they mattered later because they established beyond argument that her father was a careful, methodical man who documented everything he touched. The summer of 1984 was supposed to be his last full season. He had told Anne that he was going to work one particular claim near the Steiking Plateau through July, fly out in August, and start winding the whole operation down. He was going to put the house up for sale the following spring and move closer to her in Kamloops. He booked his flight with Odell Air Services the same way he had booked it for 6 seasons running, because Odell was reliable, Odell was reasonable, and Odell knew the lake by the claim well enough to set a float plane down on it in a crosswind. On the morning of June 9th, a neighbor named Ed Brazeau drove Halvorsen to the dock and watched him load his gear. The dock attendant, a young man named Petr Kovac, helped carry the sample crates and later remembered Halvorsen joking that the crates would weigh 3 times as much on the way back out. That is the last confirmed moment of Gordon Halvorsen's life. The Beaver taxied out, lifted off the lake heading north, and returned that afternoon with its floats empty. The pickup was scheduled for August 4th. On August 4th, Odell flew north and came back reporting the camp abandoned. No tent, he said. No cached food, no marked workings, no sign Halvorsen had lasted more than a few days. A search was organized, roughly 40 volunteers over 9 days, with a chartered helicopter and a dog team brought up from Prince George, and searchers found exactly what Odell described, which is to say they found nothing. And understand what nothing means in this context, because search coordinators will tell you that a 7-week camp is almost impossible to erase. A man living on a lakeshore for even a few days leaves a fire ring with sterilized soil beneath it, cut tent poles, flattened vegetation, a latrine, food tins, boot prints pressed into soft summer ground that hold their shape for months. The dogs found no scent trail leading away from the shoreline. There was no fire ring, no cut brush, not one boot print in 7 weeks of soft summer ground. At the time, the searchers read that absence is evidence that Halvorsen had come to grief almost immediately, perhaps within hours of landing, before he could establish a camp at all. The coroner's service eventually classified it as a presumed wilderness death, misadventure, remains not recovered, and under the provincial presumption of death provisions, his estate was settled 7 years later. Anne Halvorsen refused to accept that classification for the rest of her life. She wrote to the coroner's office every year, and she said the same thing to anyone who would listen. Her father had spent 30 summers in that country. He had walked out of a September blizzard in 1971 with a sprained ankle and half his food gone. He did not walk into the bush and evaporate on day 1 without so much as pitching his tent. She was right, though it would take 25 years for anyone to prove it. And the detail that should trouble you about the search is the same detail that troubles it in every one of these cases. The searchers were looking where Vernon Odell told them to look. He drew the X on the map. He flew the search coordinators over the site himself, at his own expense, which everyone remembered as generosity. Every search for every one of his missing passengers began from a single unverifiable claim that the drop-off had happened at all. The dogs found no scent trail because there was no scent. The ground held no boot prints because no boots had ever touched it. To understand how one man could do this for 13 years, you have to understand what bush flying in that country actually was in the 1970s and 80s, and what it was not. There was no radar coverage below several thousand feet across most of that region, and in the valleys of the northern interior, effectively none at all. There were no control towers, no departure clearances, no one watching a screen. Under the Canadian rules of the day, a pilot on a local charter was not even required to file a formal flight plan with air traffic services. He could instead leave with the regulations called a flight itinerary with any responsible person, which in practice meant a note on a clipboard in his own office, describing where he said he intended to go. A charter pilot flying out of a place like Sable Lake filed his own flight notes, kept his own logbook, and reported his own movements, and the entire system ran on the assumption that he had no reason to lie. That assumption was not naive, it was structural. The bush plane was the ambulance, the mail truck, the grocery run, and the hearse for a third of the province, and Odell himself had flown mercy flights in whiteouts, delivered diphtheria antitoxin to a village in 1978, hauled a woman in labor off a trapline at night. If a passenger vanished, the pilot was not a suspect. The pilot was a witness, usually the star witness, often the search asset, sometimes the last friendly face the family dealt with. Odell attended 2 of the memorial services. He waived a pickup fee for one grieving widow. Now set that against the mechanics of what the auditor later found. An aircraft engine carries an instrument called a recording tachometer that accumulates engine running time on its own, mechanically driven off the engine itself the way an odometer is driven off the wheels, and that figure feeds into mandatory maintenance records because engines are overhauled by the hour. The Beaver's engine, a Pratt & Whitney Wasp Jr., a 450 horsepower 9-cylinder radial, was due for a complete overhaul roughly every 1,400 hours, an overhaul that in the 1980s cost more than many small operators cleared in a season. And that economic fact is what makes Odell's paperwork so strange, and it is the anomaly that caught Faye Okima's eye before she understood anything else. A pilot who falsifies hours for money falsifies them downward, underlogging flight time to push an expensive overhaul further into the future. Odell was doing the opposite. He was inventing flight time, paying for wear his engine had never experienced, moving his own overhauls closer. No fraud runs in that direction. Okima, an auditor working a routine insurance file in 1991, a former logging camp bookkeeper who had spent a decade reconciling numbers other people wanted left alone, laid Odell's logbooks beside his maintenance records on ledger paper by hand, and found that across 61 specific charter flights, the hours Odell logged exceeded the hours his engine had actually run by a combined total of more than 90 hours, an average shortfall of nearly an hour and a half per flight. 61 flights, logged long, flown short. And the flights that were logged long were not random. They clustered overwhelmingly on the trips carrying the passengers who never came back. The Halvorsen flight, logged at 2.1 hours, supported by fuel for 1. Run the arithmetic yourself, the way she did. 2.1 hours at 85 liters an hour is roughly 180 liters. Kovac's receipt for the morning of June 10th records 88. The pattern the numbers describe is simple, and it is terrible. Odell took off with a passenger, flew roughly 20 to 30 minutes, not the 60 or 70 the destination required, did something during a window of time no instrument recorded, and flew home. Then he wrote down the flight the destination would have required, so the paper matched the story, so the invoice matched the distance, so the family's memory of the fare matched the map. He falsified the logbook to match the lie. But he could not falsify the engine, and he could not falsify the fuel dock's carbon receipts, because Petr Kovac's employer kept every one of them in a drawer in date order for years, for no better reason than that he had never gotten around to throwing anything out. Okima pulled the June 9, 1984 receipt on her second day. Her audit had begun as a formality of policy review following Odell's own death. She later told investigators that she sat with that receipt for a long time, because she understood that she was not looking at insurance fraud. Insurance fraud does not have a compass heading. She was looking at a route. Every falsified flight was short. Every short flight pointed the same general direction. A beaver on floats cruises at roughly 105 miles an hour, which means 20 to 30 minutes of flying describes a ring 35 to 50 miles out. Somewhere inside that ring, north of Sable Lake, there was a place Vernon Odell went instead. The manifest holds 7 names with no arrival record, and 3 of them show how wide this ran. Danny and Ruth Pelletier were 28 and 26 years old, newly married from Prince George. Danny was an electrician at a sawmill, Ruth a school district secretary, and they had postponed their honeymoon a full year to save for it. In August of 1982, they booked a fly-in fishing week at a rented cabin as that delayed honeymoon, and they booked it through Odell Air Services because the cabin's owner, A Smithers outfitter who had used Odell for a decade recommended him without a second thought. Ruth's mother drove them to Sable Lake and photographed them on the dock with the camera Ruth then carried aboard, Danny with a rod tube over his shoulder, Ruth laughing at something out of frame. The pickup was set for August 14th. On the 14th, Odell returned alone and reported the cabin empty, the canoe gone from its rack, and his conclusion, offered gently, was that the couple had taken the canoe out on open water and swamped. It was a plausible story because it is a real way people die up there. Cold water, no life jackets, a squall crossing a big lake in minutes. Searchers found the canoe floating capsized at the far end of the lake, and for 3 days boats dragged the bottom with grapnel hooks along the drift line the wind would have produced. They found no camp inside the cabin, no food in the cache, none of Ruth's clothing, nothing. And at the time everyone read that emptiness as evidence of a couple who had barely settled in before drowning, who had paddled out on their first or second evening. Read it now, knowing the engine hours, and it says something else entirely. It says they were never there. The canoe was staged, lifted off its rack, and set adrift by the only man with the means to reach that shoreline, on a flight nobody logged because nobody was aboard to be logged. Odell's logbook records the original drop-off at 1.9 hours. His engine and the fuel support less than half of that. The second name is Carol Meyer, and her case shows that this was not only about remote cabins, and not only about tourists. Meyer was 41, an outpost nurse who rotated between 3 small northern communities, the kind of nurse who set fractures and delivered babies 100 miles from the nearest doctor, and in February of 1986 she needed to get from Sable Lake to a settlement 90 miles northeast for a 2-week clinic posting. The health authority chartered the flight on skis in winter. Routine transport, government paper on both ends. The kind of flight that happens up there the way a bus runs in a city, which is precisely what should have protected her. She was reported missing not by family, but by the clinic when she failed to arrive, and here Odell told a different kind of lie. And the difference matters, because it shows you a man adapting his method to circumstance. He claimed he had turned back for weather and dropped Meyer at a trapper's cabin partway, at her own insistence, to wait for a second attempt. There was weather that day. A recorded ceiling of a few hundred feet, and snow at the nearest reporting station, which made the story plausible, and there was a cabin where he said there was, which made it checkable, and Odell understood that a checkable lie is more convincing than an airtight one. When searchers reached that cabin 2 days later, the stove was cold, the woodpile was undisturbed. The snow on the step held no tracks but theirs, and there was no sign Carol Meyer had ever stood inside it. Her disappearance was filed as exposure, presumed, remains not recovered, a nurse lost to the same winter she had spent her career pulling other people out of. The engine hours for that flight are short by 40 minutes. The third name is Milo Adamek, and his case is the one that finally suggests a motive, because for years even the people who grew suspicious of Odell stumbled on the question of why. There was no ransom, no insurance angle running to Odell, no known connection between the passengers. Adamek was 60, a retired millwright from Terrace, and something of a known figure in northern hunting circles because of his rifle, a custom-built model on a Mauser action with an engraved floor plate he had commissioned from a gunsmith in Furlach, Austria, insured on its own policy for $11,000, which in 1987 was most of the price of a new pickup truck. In September of that year, Odell flew him out for a 2-week moose hunt and later reported the familiar story: an empty camp, a vanished man. 14 months after that, in November of 1988, a pawnbroker in Whitehorse took in a custom rifle with an engraved floor plate, photographed it for his records as territorial law required, held it the mandated 30 days, and sold it on. When the RCMP review matched that photograph to Adamek's insurance file decades later, the engraving matched scroll for scroll, and they also pulled the pawn ticket. The seller had used a false name and a non-existent address. The handwriting analyst who compared the ticket to Odell's logbooks reported the samples were consistent with a common author, which is the hedged formal language of that discipline, and it was, per the review, the closest thing to a direct evidentiary link between Odell and any victim's property ever found. And once you see it, you see the shape of the whole thing: gear, cash, equipment, firearms. A fly-in passenger is a person who has converted weeks of wages into portable goods and carried all of it, in one load, onto a plane. Halvorsen flew with 400 pounds of outfit. The Pelletiers carried rods, reels, a camera, wedding money. Adamek carried a rifle worth a year of some men's savings in the North's second-hand market, spread across a dozen towns and 2 territories, could absorb used gear without a single question asked. 7 passengers, all of them provisioned for weeks in the bush, all of them carrying their outfits with them onto that plane, several of them paying their fares in cash that no ledger ever saw. Investigators came to believe the flights themselves may have been the harvest. So let us walk the chain of evidence in the order it was actually assembled, because this case was not solved by a detective. It was solved by paper and by the handful of people who refused to throw paper away. The first link is the engine. The 61 flight discrepancy Faye Okama documented in 1991, more than 90 hours of flying that existed in ink and nowhere else. She escalated it to the RCMP within the week. And to their credit, the detachment did not file it and forget it. The second link is the fuel dock archive, hundreds of carbon receipts in date order, which let investigators do something remarkable. Fuel burn is arithmetic. An engine of that type at cruise power burns its 85 liters an hour within a narrow band. And by reconciling every fill against every logged flight, accounting for taxi time and warm-up, they reconstructed within a margin the review estimates at 5 or 6 minutes, how long the Beaver had genuinely flown on each of the suspect days, and the reconstructed durations drew a circle on the map, a ring of lakes 20 to 30 flying minutes north of Kestrel Lake. A Beaver on floats needs roughly half a mile of open water to land and take off safely loaded, which eliminated most of the ponds inside that ring and left investigators looking at fewer than a dozen candidate lakes. The third link is Wallace Deer. In October of 1985, Deer, a trapper then in his 40s, booked a flight to his trapline and arrived at the dock with his dog, a big crossbred animal that went everywhere he did. Odell refused the animal flatly with a vehemence Deer found strange in a bush pilot, because bush pilots haul dogs the way city cabs haul luggage, and the argument grew heated enough that Deer took his gear back off the plane and arranged another pilot days later. He thought little of it for 6 years, beyond a lingering irritation. When investigators canvassed former passengers in 1992, Deer told them the detail that had stuck with him, the thing he had seen while loading and unloading his own gear through the cargo door. Lashed under the rear bench seat where cargo netting usually rode was a coil of heavy chain and 2 cinder blocks. He had assumed they were anchor weights for the floats and thought it strange, because float planes do not anchor that way. They tie off to shore or beach on the floats, and no pilot hauls 60 pounds of dead concrete around the sky for nothing, because in a small aircraft every pound of useless weight costs payload and fuel. Investigators noted 2 further things. A Beaver's rear seat sits directly beside the cargo door, a door nearly 3 feet wide with a low sill, the door that opens over water, and a dog, unlike a person, cannot be talked into sitting calmly, and cannot be lied to about what it smells. The fourth link is the White Horse Pawn ticket, the false name, the handwriting consistent with Odell's. And the fifth link is Sable Lake. It sits almost exactly at the center of the fuel reconstruction circle, deep, cold, glacially scoured, over 300 feet in the middle. A lake with no cabins, no claims, no outfitters' camps, no reason for a charter pilot ever to visit. And it appears in Odell's legitimate records too, because he occasionally listed it without explanation as a technical stop. Think about what that phrase is doing. A technical stop is a landing with no commercial purpose, a note that exists so that if anyone ever saw his aircraft on that water, the paper would already hold an innocent answer. In September of 1994, a volunteer dive team working with the RCMP spent 9 days on that lake, running sonar transects from a barge by day and diving the returns by morning in water that was 6 degrees at the surface and 4 degrees at depth, with visibility of perhaps 10 feet in the glacial silt. The depth beat them in the middle. 300 feet is far beyond safe air diving, and the technical mixed gas methods that could reach it barely existed outside military and commercial work in 1994. But on a shelf along the northern shore, at roughly 90 feet, right at the practical limit of what those divers could work, they recovered a weighted canvas duffel. Its mouth chained shut through brass grommets, the padlock corroded solid, and inside it, a rock hammer with the initials GH stamped into the head, a rusted tackle box, and a camera body of the model Ruth Pelletier's mother said she had carried onto the dock. Sit with what that duffel means. Gordon Halvorsen disappeared in 1984. Ruth Pelletier disappeared in 1982. Their belongings went into the lake together in one bag, which means Odell did not simply dispose of things in the moment. He kept items, consolidated them, and returned to Sable Lake to sink them, and the technical stops in his records may be a partial log of exactly those trips. Near the duffel, on the same shelf, the divers recovered partial human skeletal remains, preserved by water cold enough and still enough to slow every process that would elsewhere have erased them. The forensic technology of 1994 could not identify them. There were no usable dental records to compare, and the DNA methods of the day needed more and better material than the lake had left. So the remains were held, cataloged, and stored for 15 years until the science caught up, and in 2009, a mitochondrial DNA comparison, the kind that traces the maternal line, run against a sample provided by the Pelletier family, confirmed what the camera had already suggested. Ruth Pelletier had been found. She had never reached the fishing cabin. She had come down 26 flying minutes from the dock where her mother took her photograph, and she had been in Sable Lake the entire time her searchers were dragging grapples through another lake 60 miles away, exactly where Vernon Odell had told them to look. There is one more document, and in some ways it is the coldest one in the file. Vernon Odell died on October 12, 1989, when his Beaver went down in low cloud on a solo positioning flight, no passengers aboard. What matters is how long it took to find him. 11 months. Nearly a full year for one of the most recognizable aircraft in the region, flown by its most recognizable pilot, and the reason is in the crash investigation report. The wreckage carried no emergency locator transmitter, the crash-activated beacon, the ELT, that every aircraft of its class was required to carry, and to understand the weight of that absence you need one piece of history. Canada mandated those beacons in 1974, in the aftermath of the Martin Hartwell crash of 1972, in which a downed bush plane in the Northwest Territories went unlocated for 32 days, while its pilot survived beside the wreck and his passengers did not, a search that consumed enormous resources and national attention, precisely because a small aircraft without a beacon is a needle in a country the size of Europe. An ELT contains an impact switch. It triggers itself on hard deceleration and broadcasts on an emergency frequency, and from 1982 onward, satellites of the new International Search and Rescue System listened for that frequency continuously, and the very first life that system ever saved was in a light aircraft crash in British Columbia in September of 1982 in Odell's own province, in Odell's own flying country. Which means that for most of the 1980s, an ELT did not just help searchers find a crash. It could report a hard landing automatically from anywhere to a satellite without the pilot's consent. Odell's mounting bracket was in the airframe. The unit was gone, and the maintenance record showed it had been signed out for servicing years earlier in the late 1970s and never signed back in, an omission that passed unremarked through a decade of annual inspections signed off by a small-town engineer who had no reason to doubt the most trusted pilot on the lake. For years, Odell had flown an aircraft that could not be tracked, could not be found, and could never contradict him about where it had been. The report drew no conclusions about intent, and neither will this episode, but when Faye Okima was later asked which single page of the file stayed with her, she did not name the fuel receipt or the engine hours. She named the empty bracket. No charge was ever laid because the only suspect had been dead for 2 years before anyone suspected him. There was no trial, no confession, no interrogation transcript, and so there are questions this file will never close, beginning with the largest one. The RCMP Historical Review, when it was finally compiled, treats 7 manifest names as linked to Odell Air Services with no arrival record, and it flags something worse, that Odell's manifests were his own paperwork too, written by the same hand that falsified the logbooks. Cash passengers, itinerant workers, seasonal tree planters, people traveling alone with no family expecting a call, the exact population the North has always drawn, and the exact population whose disappearances generate the least paper, may simply never have been written down. A man who inflated his flight hours to invent journeys could just as easily omit a fare entirely, and a fare who was never recorded was never missed, never searched for, and never counted. The review declines to estimate a true number, and so must we. Ruth Pelletier is the only one of the 7 ever recovered. Gordon Halvorsen's hammer came home to his daughter Anne, who had spent 25 years telling anyone who would listen that her father did not vanish, who had written the coroner's office every year and kept every assay envelope in its shoebox, and who lived just long enough to be told she had been right. Danny Pelletier, Carol Meyer, Milo Adamek, and 2 names this episode has held back at their family's request remain. Formally, missing persons. Sable Lake has been dived twice more since, in 2001 with technical mixed gas teams and in 2015 with side-scan sonar and a remotely operated vehicle that finally reached the deep basin. And the basin explains its own silence, because the bottom of a glacially fed lake is meters of rock flour silt, soft as smoke, and it closes over what it is given. The lake has given nothing else back. That is where the record ends, not with an arrest, not with an answer, but with a lake that is 300 feet deep at the center, and a truth the North makes plain in every one of these cases. Up there, the wilderness gets blamed for a great many things, and it carries the blame without complaint. And once in a long while, the paper survives long enough to show that the wilderness was innocent, and the man everyone trusted to cross it was not. If this case stayed with you the way it stayed with the people who assembled it, consider subscribing and leave a like so these stories, and the names inside them, reach the people who are still waiting on answers of their own. Until the next file, thank you for listening.